climb boldly, brave that high peak. You'll never know failure if bravely you seek. Sing with me now. Dare to be different, dare to be free, dare to run far like wind on the sea. Fly like a gull, soar high on the air, be strong in your courage when others despair. Never in anger, never in haste, go without pride, be never abased. Freedom is yours, if freedom you give, to all give you freely, enjoy you'll then live. Mountains that stand up tall to the sky, tell us no dreaming is ever too high. Dare to climb boldly, brave that high peak, you'll never know failure if bravely you seek. Dare to be different, dare to be free, dare to run far like wind on the sea. Fly like a gull, soar high on the air, be strong in your courage when others despair. Be strong in your courage when others despair. Be strong in your courage when others despair.
Are there people here who've never been in this room before? Are there any who are entirely new? Okay, very good. Are you familiar with Yogananda's teachings and so on? And Swami Kriyananda is the founder of Ananda? Okay, so I don't have to fill in all the history. That's what I just wanted to know. I met Swami Kriyananda in 1969, a few days before Thanksgiving. He was giving a talk at Stanford University. I had been a student there, but I had dropped out after 1 year, and I still lived in the area, and he was speaking, and a friend of mine had already met him because he was teaching in the San Francisco area. She called up and said, I have met a real teacher, and I think you'll like him. And her name is Lakshmi. She still lives at Ananda Village, and it's a debt that can never be repaid. And I did like him quite a lot. And I was struck by his consciousness before he spoke. It was an experience I was not prepared to have. I was not a psychic kind of person. You know, woo-woo things did not happen to me. In fact, I had not been able to read Autobiography of a Yogi because it just, there were just too many miracles in it. And I was a spiritually minded person, but I was very austere. And I just felt there was too much fluff in that book. Fluff to me was people materializing and miracles and stuff like that. I was just, had this very rigid, is the only actual word for it. I was, let's see, about 15 pounds smaller than I am now. I had these little beady glasses. I had my hair in tight little braids. I was a tight little person. And, but Swami walked into the room, and he didn't speak. I mean, before he spoke. And he was about as far away as the back door, and it was this tent, and they had set up bleachers, and I had come with people who wanted to be as far away from him as possible. So we were sitting in the last row of bleachers, which actually turned out to be rather fun, like this, and he walked in over there, and his consciousness immediately took over the whole space. Just immediately. And even though I was as far from him as I could have been, I felt like he was right there. And it wasn't even, there was no scary music. There was nothing. It was just, he simply came in and that's who he was. He was as big as the entire room, probably bigger. It's just that there were boundaries, and he was as close to me as anyone could be, even though he was far away, and he hadn't spoken a word. He just came in, and it was his aura, it was his vibrations. I've learned lots of words since then. And all I could feel, and it came right into my head, was this is what I'm looking for. And I had been looking for it ever since I was born almost. Well, ever since I was born. As long as I could remember, I'd been looking for freedom. Somebody who wasn't confined. You know, paradoxically, I'd made myself extremely confined in the idea of trying to be unconfined, but we don't always behave smart. But he overwhelmed me with his consciousness. And then he talked, and I have no recollection of what he said, except that when he finished, I thought, this is the most intelligent man I have ever met, which was nice, because I have an intellectual mind. I like words, I like humor, I like clever turn of phrase, and he was wonderfully satisfying on all those levels. I think I would have followed him anyway. I felt it was a bonus, like that. Then it took a little more than a year before I was able to extricate myself from the life I had in San Francisco and move up to Ananda Village where he lived, June 1st, 1971. A Tuesday, he said to arrive before noon. It was more auspicious to arrive before noon. Arrive on a Tuesday before noon, so I did. And then I got to know Swami, and I realized that he had, let me put all this together exactly. You know, his intelligence so far transcended anything I had ever encountered. And I'd moved in hardly rarefied circles, but the circle of the world I moved in were people who were highly educated and had that kind of smarts. That was just my milieu. But Swamiji had this capacity to look at life and understand it, to look at people and understand them, to look at circumstances and know the answer, to look at the challenges of his own life and find creative ways to go forward that was a whole other order of magnitude from anything that I even imagined was possible. I mean, it made life exceedingly entertaining. It was totally fun. He really helped me begin to resolve. It's taken most of my life to resolve it, but the conundrum that I had always felt, which is I have the kind of talent that is highly prized in America, which is what I call school smarts, where you can just go to school and pass the tests and all that. I went through 1 year of college. I never learned anything in school that was useful to me, ever. Not one thing. I really have tried to find one thing. I learned to read before I ever went to school. Everybody in my family was reading. I just started reading, I don't know, 3 or 4 years old, because that's what everybody did, so I was just going to do it too. And then I just went through all of that, effortlessly excelling with this terrified inner life, because so much praise for so little effort, so much respect for something that meant nothing to me, just nothing to me. It's past lives, been there, done that. It's not that it has no value, but it had no value for me. So always living in this strange, we're talking about courage and confidence, in this strange conflict of enormous expectation, enormous external evaluation, and absolute knowledge that the whole thing was a fake. Because it was asking, I wasn't doing anything. I was merely existing and not using anything that I had, and I didn't know what I had, and nobody was anywhere was talking to me about what I really needed. They were just asking me to answer their stupid quizzes, Just, it meant nothing. So when I met Swamiji, what I saw there was not not a repudiation of that kind of learning, which I didn't disrespect it, I just knew it was insufficient. In fact, he made everybody else's education look like kindergarten. And he was just so extraordinarily well informed on any issue. But more than that, he began to work with what was really going on inside a person. And he just perceived the talents that you had, but then also began to pull you into a more holistic way of being. But having my prejudice and my taste still be biased a little bit toward that kind of intelligence, I was also just utterly intrigued as to just how he could be so smart, you know? And he also was a college dropout, not that I had that much respect for formal education. He went up to the last semester of his senior year, but it clearly didn't come from Haverford or Brown University. And I actually really began to try to ask myself, what is the secret of the clarity and the brilliance of his mind? And toward the end of his life, and some of you may have only met him at the end, when he was older, his body shrank, as elder people do. He was 86 when he died, so a lot of the normal changes of age took place for him, and he became somewhat small in this part of his body. But when he was younger, he had this enormous chest always. Even when he was skinny, his weight varied somewhat, but he always had this chest. And in the Mahabharata, which is the epic from which the Bhagavad Gita is taken, one of the main characters in that is Arjuna. And Arjuna is the great warrior, and he's the great warrior with the bow. And much of the Mahabharata and all of the Gita is symbolic of deeper realities. And being skilled with the bow like this was actually being powerful in meditation, is what it meant. Because the front of the bow was the body like this, the back of the bow was the straight spine, and the arrow was the arrow of your concentration. So when he was powerful, he was deeply concentrated on the spiritual eye, and when he became afraid, he let his bow, he released the bow, and then the string became limp, and Arjuna lost his confidence, and then Krishna buoyed him up again, and he could do it again. Swami Kriyananda's body was the shape of a bow, totally straight spine, beautiful chest like this, uplifted. And I realized when I looked at him, if I looked at him in profile, his forehead was just slightly behind his heart. And so that it was like if you think of your own body as like the prow of a ship, and you're cutting through the waves of life, I realized that he moved first from the heart. It wasn't like he was way out of balance, but his heart was just a little bit ahead of his mind, always. And much later, Swamiji, not much later, but sometime later, Swamiji was talking to me about meditation. And he said, everybody talks in meditation about the necessity to calm the mind. He said, but restlessness does not actually originate in the mind. We experience it in the mind. Restlessness originates in the heart. Because what happens in the heart is we have likes and dislikes. We have desires, we have disappointments, we have angers, we have resentments, we have fears, we have anxieties. And those are all feelings first. They're feelings first, and then the way the human consciousness is constructed, as Yogananda put it so simply, reason always follows your feelings. Whatever the prejudice of the heart is, the mind is going to follow it. The prejudice, and so what we're actually talking about when we're meditating is if we can calm the heart, then the mind will automatically follow. Because think about it, what is it that disturbs your mind? I'm anxious about this thing I have to do. You're replaying an argument with someone where you weren't quick enough to say what you really wanted to say. You're thinking through about how they've done you wrong and how you're really going to get back at them. One is weeping about disappointments you've had in your life. Where does all of that originate? It originates from the heart, doesn't it? That's why in the serious practice of meditation, we work a lot also with the heart to calm those feelings and then raise them to the spiritual eye. But we'll touch on that in a few minutes. And so what I began to understand about Swamiji was the brilliant clarity of his mind was quite simply the courage of his heart. Even his posture is that he was not afraid of anything. He wasn't afraid of humiliation. He wasn't afraid of being misunderstood. He wasn't afraid of putting himself out in any way that was necessary. This is such a small incident, but it just was so dear to me. Many years later, when he moved to India in 2003, when he went to live in India in 2003, there was a bookstore in one of the local malls, and he would often go over there to have a coffee at the little shop and then go into the bookstore. And Swami was always ready to talk to anyone about, especially about spiritual things, especially, or open a conversation that could lead to it. We were standing in this little book area, and we were in front of the metaphysical books, and there was a copy of Autobiography of a Yogi there. And we were just looking at some books, and some Indian man comes in and he pulls the book off the shelf, just innocently, and starts looking at it. Swami just, with the full power of his consciousness, says, "I was his disciple," just like that. And the man sort of, was not initiating the conversation. "I lived with him. He was the most magnificent person ever imaginable," or something. Swami said it better than that. And this man, just sort of, he wasn't... It wasn't one of Swami's greater successes, but who knows? The man sort of put the book back and slunk away. But I just thought to myself, there was never a moment in Swamiji's mind about himself in that. I mean, that was, again, such a small example. But all through the time that I knew Swamiji, whenever he saw what needed to be done, he simply did it. And that calmness of the heart was what made it possible for reason to follow feeling, and reason was not corrupted by all of these personal anxieties. Now, this is the fruit of many lifetimes of spiritual effort. It's very easy to describe, but not so easy to carry out. I myself have been extremely impressed lately by how many, not just this life, but how much we carry around that's still just lodged here that we barely know anything about. I easily believe in past incarnations. I had one dream of an actual past life. I've had intuitions about others and common sense understanding from, once you understand past lives and that we're not meeting for the first time, it just becomes the most obvious thing in the world. You see people, you know them. You've never met them before, but you know them perfectly well. There's a few people whose names I can never get straight because I'm sure their name is something else. And it never straightens itself out in my mind. I have to always translate from, well, you used to be, a simple name like Brian, but now your name is Travis. You used to be Linda, and now you're Patricia, and I have to just keep trying to hold it straight. I sometimes just give up and just call them what I used to call them. Master, of course, Yoganandaji had greater capacity when Durga Mata, who was Florina Darling, isn't that an amazing name, Florina Darling? Anyway, that was her name. And when she came to him, he just looked at her and he said, "Durga Mata." He said, "That's who you were when I knew you before." So he just gave her her name back again, because for him this Florina business was just an interlude until she got herself organized to come back to him, and then he just called her who she'd always been. Oh yes, I had this one very powerful dream, extremely powerful dream of a very, very negative life in which somebody that I intensely disliked and very much feared had a great deal of power over me and used it in a really horrible manner. Of course, it has to be said, I also, at different other incarnations, had a great deal of power over her and also used it in a horrible manner. I want that to be said just for the record, so it's all straight. We were just tortured each other in a pretty creative and impressive way for a few lifetimes. But when I had that dream, it was so interesting to me. This was fairly early in my time at Ananda Village, and as I said, only time in my life it ever happened, but I went in and out of this dream most of the night long. And the next day, it was so clear to me, and the dream took place at a time when there were horses and carriages and kings and queens. So a few hundred years ago, or maybe a whole cycle ago, who knows. So it wasn't yesterday. But I walked around acting as if it had happened yesterday. And not merely because I had remembered the dream only explained to me why I had such a feeling about this person. Just, fear and dislike and all of these things. It was just now, because it had happened to me. On a certain level, it had never resolved. And interestingly, just to tell you the whole story, the dream was very interesting, because in the dream I lost everything. I lost my position, I lost my family, just everything. And I had been a revolutionary, and I had been caught. And everybody was murdered, except for me. And I ended up in a convent. I was a woman. And in the dream, the whole dream started with my being very content. Interesting. I was very, very content in the dream. And I also realized that everything that had happened had to happen, and was positive, because it had brought me both to that convent and to the state of peace. Interesting. And then I went through the horrific dream and saw what had brought me there. But I also realized that even though on a certain level I had accepted, the trauma of it was still in there. You know, so that whenever I saw this person in their present incarnation, in which they were a perfectly nice person, this is how Swami finally said it to us, because we ended up having to present to him both her side of it and mine. And he said, first he acknowledged it all. He said, I think all this is true. But then he said, but neither of you could ever do anything like that again. You know, you've grown, you've finished. You could never be those people anymore. So what you're afraid of in each other is no longer in each other. You understand? That was, I mean, like, usually we use past lives to justify. This is why I don't like you. This is what I'm afraid of. This is how you treated me. I obviously have had a lot of force in my life, and I think I haven't always used it well. So a lot of people carry a lot with me. Let's just put it that way. One woman who was dying called up to tell me how much she'd always disliked me. Wow. I said, you know, I've always really liked you. I didn't even know it, you know, so we had to have a deathbed reconciliation, because we've all changed, but the trauma remains. And and we hold it. We just think about it. Think how many people die. What if somebody murdered you? What if you murdered somebody else? What if you were hit by a car? What if you died of starvation? I mean, just think of all the horrific things that happen to people. You don't always see God and then just let it go. It just stays in there, and then mercifully you forget it, and then you start over again, and then you have these strange attractions, aversions, fears, attunements, and we make really stupid decisions. You know, I always wonder, this woman who was part of our, let me think how this went exactly. Oh yes, we were talking about reincarnation and so on. With this woman friend of mine, she'd been married for 60 years. And it was what I would call a quasi-victorious marriage. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't hard, but it wasn't so great. She didn't have any belief in anything, but she was a volunteer at a hospital where nuns were the nurses. And after her husband died, somebody was comforting her and said, well, you'll see him again, meaning in heaven, which wasn't her way of thinking. And she said in her way, I think 60 years was quite long enough. So what happens when you encounter each other again? You have both the positive and the negative. All of that stuff plays out. It's not finished. A woman came to me and she was in just a mess of a relationships, just a mess. And she said, I really want to finish this karma. I said, well, you're going to have to find another counselor, because I don't know how to help you finish this. We can progress it, but don't kid yourself. You're not going to finish this. You don't have the inner freedom to finish it. And it's a geological strata in you. You know, being a victim, being abandoned, being mistreated, all of those things. Now, all of this whole rather long, and you might consider gruesome and depressing story, is really just to talk to us about how much is going on within us that we don't know. And how very, very, very many knots we have to untie. And that the project that we're working on, courage, confidence, calmness, is not something that we're just going to get a little mantra and then we're going to be able to work with. Especially if we actually genuinely want to be free. There's lots of coping mechanisms, and we all have ours. We avoid certain situations, we seek out others, we do all kinds of things to make it work in the right way. But if we genuinely want to be free, I mean, what was it that enabled Swami to walk into that room and to just go right up and meet me? And he didn't recognize me, you should know. It wasn't like one of those, oh, you've come kind of things. In fact, for various reasons, that night was a horrible night. It was 1969. It was just at the time when Swami was trying to make Ananda work, and everything was difficult. And it was at the Beta Chi fraternity house, and that tent was usually used for parties. And I think the beer vibes were kind of in the walls. And I remember at a certain point, and Swami had some musicians with him who at the time lived at Ananda Village, but eventually moved on because they weren't at all in tune. They were like jazz musicians, like this. And he was trying to have us chant Om. This I do remember. And the musicians started playing, and the beer vibes started affecting people, and everybody's, this really raucous, and literally somebody next to me was singing 99 bottles of beer on the wall. And Swami was trying to have us chant Om. Now, these are fragments of memories, and I remember the musicians like this, and I remember this guy going into his own little rendition of God knows what. And that's all I remember. Because, the context, it was my first experience of any of that. I just didn't know how it all fit together. But later, much later, I reminded Swamiji that was, he said, he may have asked me, when did we first meet? I said, the Beta Chi fraternity house tent, November 1969. You were there? He said like that. And then he said, that was one of the worst nights of my life. And then he sort of shrugged and said, well, at least something good came out of it. So what I'm saying is there was nothing personal, because he did not remember meeting me there at all. But his habit was fearless. His habit was not to shrink from anything or anyone. His habit was wherever he was, he simply expanded his aura out as far as it could go. And it went to whoever was there to receive it. And I was in the back of the room, and I received it. I received it. I was so ready for this that I received it. But think about all the reasons why we don't normally do that. And it's all those reasons are all of these feelings in the heart, whether conscious or not, all these memories of things that happened to us. And sometimes it's just common sense. I remember when I first moved to Ananda Village, we lived up, everyone lived up, well, not quite everyone, but many people lived up at what is the seclusion retreat, which is, for those of you who know, 6 miles back on the dirt road. This was 1971. There was, of course, no cell phones, no internet, nothing like that, which is fine because we had no electricity. So what we defined it as no telephones, no radios, no television, no electric lights. It was heaven on earth. Absolutely fabulous. I discovered things like the moon. I never knew that there was such a thing as the moon. But we were so isolated. And when I first went up there, I don't think I hardly left for like about 6 months. I would go into Nevada City because I was running the kitchen and I drove the truck in. But I didn't come back down to the Bay Area where I live, San Francisco, for about 6 months. And during that time, because I lived in such a supportive environment, and not only was I living right near Swamiji and all of the wonderful souls that were part of Ananda are still part of Ananda, many specifically, and other wonderful souls, that I just began to let down layers of protection. I moved from 4th and Geary Street in San Francisco, which is about as urban as you can get, and I rode the Montgomery Express bus down to, the Geary Express bus down to Montgomery Street, where I worked as a legal secretary. I was a very bad secretary, but I had a job in any case. And so that was my life. I read, this is just by the way, I read the 3-volume Valmiki Ramayana, 1,000 pages. And I read it on the Geary bus back and forth. And I became so involved in the story that I can become very involved in stories. The only plane I ever missed, I was sitting in the airport reading a novel and I forgot I was in the airport. And I looked up and, an hour had passed. I totally missed my plane. Fortunately, it was just a little plane, so it didn't matter. But so I'm there like this, and Sita has been abducted by Ravana, and Rama doesn't know where she is, and we don't know if she's going to come back or not. And I just looked up, and everybody around me was just carrying on, as if nothing had happened. And I had this almost irresistible impulse to say, wait, Sita has been abducted. How can you look so cheerful? Then I realized that was crazy. So I shut the book and went back in. But that's how we live, isn't it? We're always keeping ourselves protected because we're in atmospheres where we won't be understood. And when I came back to the Bay Area for the first time after 6 months, I had just taken down so many layers. And I remember not paying attention to the gas and having to just pull off somewhere on the East Bay side, and I found myself in a very rough area. But I was so unconscious, I didn't even know where I was. Oh, there's a gas station, I'll go to the gas station like this. And I just started relating to people as I had been relating. I was 24. I was a not unattractive woman, and all of a sudden I'm putting out all this energy, and several men started responding to me in ways that I recognized, but it took me a little bit of time to recognize what I was getting back. And all of a sudden I sort of looked around and realized where I was and sort of got back into the car and rolled up the window. But that's how we live all the time, isn't it? And I'm not just talking about actual danger or involvement with the wrong people, but we're always protected. What are we protecting? We're protecting the memory of all the times that we've been hurt. Wow, is that really worth protecting? We're perpetuating the story that it's dangerous to be open-hearted. And what is the danger to us? I mean, yes, sometimes there's literal physical danger and it's not wise, but most of the time, we're not in any danger. We're just protecting ourselves because we live as if it was yesterday, in the memory of all the times it didn't work out. And we have this very strange idea that as long as I keep worshiping those memories and letting them rule my life, then I'll be safer than if I let them go. This is what the spiritual path is about. The spiritual path is not about just getting everything a little better. And Master, when he was teaching, was extraordinarily creative in what he taught. And he taught people how to be healthy, wealthy, how to have the right relationships, how to have a happy marriage, how to draw the right partner to you, how to have money. His book, little book, How to Be Happy All the Time, an amazing amount of that book is about money. It's fascinating to me because money is a big happiness or not happiness maker in life. The absence of it and the capacity to attract and make money involves you in many of the same skills that you need to realize God. Concentration, energy, courage, determination, creativity. I mean, you can make a long list. Success in this world is not antithetical to spiritual success because it's the same energy and basically the same principles, but it's not the same thing. So it's not as if we measure our spiritual success by our worldly success. In fact, I've noticed at Ananda, and this is not without exception, there are exceptions to this, Ananda I mean everywhere, is that people who are big successes in the world rarely come to our temples because life is working for them. And so the people who come to our temples, it doesn't mean that they're not successes or can't be, because in fact when you have spiritual principles you can do everything a lot better. But some part of you knows that this world is not my home. And some part of us knows that I have a home and I'm just looking for it. One friend of mine, American man, the first time he went to India, after he came back, he said, well, I can live more comfortably in America, he said, knowing there is a country to which I do actually belong. Just that resonance in his heart that culture was really his culture. Not even India as it is now, but just that culture was his culture. I consider India sort of a vitamin, is how it feels to me. If I'm away from there too long, I feel this sort of deficiency. You have to just go back and whatever that soil has to give us, it's completely different. But when you're really serious, and we get very serious about the spiritual path, what we have resolved to do is really to face and overcome all of that. I mean, I don't mean tomorrow, because we don't even know most of it is in there. We don't really know much of the time why we're reacting. We just do. And you can't actually reach it from the mind. You can't just reason it out. And most of the times we don't know our past lives. We can't remember. But you can feel certain things in us, and then every so often God gives you just a little touch of telling you what it's about. So let me bring it down to where we need to really be for this. I was going to say a paradox. To have courage, you have to have courage, which is really not going to tell you anything useful, is it? Right? But the song that Ram sang, and sang it in such a way that I understand why Swami said, "This is your theme song, young man," is you could feel the power of that. Dare to be different. Dare to be free. And I was concentrating especially on that phrase, dare to be free. You would think, why would it take daring to be free? Because all that we have cherished as our reasons to make us small, it all has to be faced and released. And the reason it's kept secret from us is because it's way, way, way too much. And all that happens is it rises up. I think of karma like this. If you were on the beach and you buried a whole bunch of paper clips at all different depths, and then you had magnets of different strengths, and you start running those magnets over the sand like this, then all the little paper clips will start sort of working their way to the top. And depending how deeply they're buried and how powerful the magnet is, they'll make it to the surface at all different times, but always in relationship to what's pulling them upward. And that's really an exact picture of the spine and the many vrittis of karma that are in the spine. I mean, a vritti of karma has a center point of some commitment of energy that we have made that we deeply identify with. When I was the nun, in that life that I remembered, part of me created a vritti that was a very gratifying vritti of life in a convent, of just having walked away from everything that had been my life before, losing everything, but therefore coming to this settled place in religious life. And that was a very strong vritti for me, which I came into this life, and I joined the monastery for the first 10 years that I lived at Ananda village. And I still, to this day, I have this beautiful settled feeling about, I read about Teresa of Avila. I went to this island somewhere in Greece. I can't remember where it was, but it's well known. And there was this little stone cell with this little water tap and this little stone bed. I mean, some people would consider it horrible. I just went and I sat on that little stone bed and I looked at those bare walls and I looked at that little water tap, and I just had such a happy feeling in my heart, because there's a vritti in me that I've built this whole positive world around that whole way of life. And then of course there's another vritti over here. One of my a woman who gave me a past life reading once, whether it was true or not, it's apocryphal. First she said, you helped start the French Revolution. She was talking about the gift of gab that I have. You helped start the French Revolution. She said, you've been involved in a lot of revolutions, which I'm sure I have. And then she said, you used your persuasion, your capacity to persuade, to bring a lot of people to wrong ideas, meaning limited ideas. Not that I was malicious. And so now I have to just keep bringing people to higher ideas until the balance is settled. But in one of those revolutionary ideas, I was, this is intuition, but I believe it's true, I was thrown out by my family because I presented such a threat to them. And I was incorrigible. I totally wouldn't listen at all, but I still blamed them. And I died completely unreconciled with them. So I've always had this fierce feeling. I can almost say against families. You know, it's not quite that irrational, but it's close to it. I have like no respect for families. I've had to learn because I made a lot of mistakes counseling people. I've had to learn to understand what the purpose of families is. I mean, that may sound strange to everyone, but I have this very strong vritti that families are a threat to your well-being. And so we run all of these all the time. And you may or may not remember. And as sometimes I feel that stories are apocryphal. They may not actually be true, but they fit the facts. And it helps me to make a little story around it. Because if it really does fit, if it's fantasy, that's not good, but if it really does fit, for me it helps focus. And some of that, I believe, is intuition. But we have all those vrittis, that's what I'm saying, and these vrittis are in the spine, and these are strong commitments of energy that we sustain. Death doesn't stop it, because it's not physical. It's vibrational, and in fact, when we die, the astral body, the vibrational body that we take, is literally composed of all these vrittis. From one life, all the incarnations that you've built up and all the changes that you've made in this life, and you go into the astral world, and the collective vibration determines which astral world you go into. And the restlessness created by those vrittis are what brings you back into your body. You're there in the astral world, and if you're a fairly good person, I think you're having a fairly good time. Master said, if you don't know that consciousness can exist outside the brain, when you lose your brain, you lose consciousness. In fact, I love the way Master put it. If you've meditated and have an understanding that consciousness is independent of the brain, you can at least maintain some awareness as you make that transition. If you only believe that the physical world is real, when the physical body begins to die, Master said, I love this, you feel obligated to go unconscious because you don't have anywhere in your awareness where you think you can stay conscious. And he said you never wake up in the astral world. It's kind of, as he put it, like a gray dream. And you don't wake up until you have another physical body. And then this is a familiar world and you go back into it. For those of us who may be able to retain consciousness, these vrittis make us restless. We're not at peace. The heart is not calm because we're still resentful, angry, fearful, attached, desirous. And we see the man that we'd hoped to marry that Rosemary got instead of me. And we see that he's incarnated. And we see that Rosemary's heading there too. And bing, you go as fast as you can. And darn it if you don't end up in the same womb as Rosemary and you're twins now competing for this guy. And it's because those vrittis are unsettled. And Swamiji, by contrast, and he also said this at various times, although he never said it emphatically, and he actually wouldn't let me publish it, but now he's not here to stop me. He essentially said that he had no subconscious meaning below the conscious level, that consciousness and subconsciousness for him was all the same, which is saying there are no vrittis, and which would be consistent with everything that he was. And that's why there was no fear, because there was no conflicting energy, all the energy in his spine. And see, what happens is the energy, I haven't forgotten about the paper clips either, the energy in the spine circulates through the chakras, and when we're wholly integrated and focused spiritually, all of that energy is guided from the spiritual eye. The spiritual eye is our individuality, but connected to our divinity. Okay, the ego is from the medulla, it's the opposite pole here. It's our individuality, but that individuality is identified with our physical body and our personality and our karma. And so the process of spiritual life is to move from the ego to the spiritual eye. But what happens is, instead of that energy circulating, entering and circulating in such a way that it all is focused through the spiritual eye, it's pre-committed into all these vrittis. I think of it like the UPS truck. He has a lot of packages and he has to deliver them to all these vrittis. This is our package of energy, but much of it is addressed to maintaining this resentment and this fear and this memory and this attachment and this desire. And so we only have so much energy, a certain amount of energy that we can direct properly, because all the rest of it is already preoccupied. That's karma. That's why people make a great effort to be successful in this way and don't quite succeed, or they make a great effort and do succeed. because the vrittis dictate where the energy is drawn and how our decisions are made. Working out karma, resolving karma, is when the center point of that vritti is dissolved, and then therefore the energy doesn't go, it disappears. A vritti is a whirlpool. And so if you take away the center point, the energy just flows straight instead of being distracted and going in a circle, just like a physical river would. So the stronger the flow in the spine, which is to say the stronger the flow of the river of energy, every vritti that, it's just a magnetic relationship. Every vritti, let's say it has 5, whatever you would call it, of energy, and the river only has 4.5, then the whirlpool's always going to get some of the energy. If the river goes up to 5.5, every vritti that's less than 5.5 is just going to get drawn into the river. And this is what meditation does, you see, and spiritual practice of all kinds, especially when you concentrate here. You increase the flow of the river. This is why you can change your life completely just by meditating, if you meditate with enough energy, and I have to say, in the right way. This is why Master in Autobiography of a Yogi describes Kriya Yoga as the airplane route to God. 1 round of Kriya is equivalent, he said, to 1 year of right living, presuming that you don't create more karma than you resolve in that year, which is a very, very big presumption. But this is the magnet over the sand, over the buried paper clips. The more powerful the magnet, the more paper clips come to the surface. And sometimes they come to the surface and they're just sucked into the river, and all we feel is freer and lighter. And we don't even actually know why. You know, since I took Kriya, since I started meditating, since I started coming here, since I started doing yoga postures, since I became a disciple, anything that increases your identification with spirit instead of with ego, you just begin to resolve karma and you begin to feel freer. Sometimes, however, there's a lot of debris in that whirlpool, and it does not resolve without your noticing. And whether that is some unexpected, and our first response is usually unwelcome. I often write to people, well, Divine Mother has taken seemingly an unwelcome interest in your life. Isn't that so? Look, Divine Mother seems more committed to your spiritual freedom than you are. Because all of a sudden, some piece of karma has come to the surface, and rather than just being absorbed, it's creating chaos on the surface of your life. But, and the devotee says, God never sends you a test bigger than you can handle. Mother Teresa of Calcutta said, yes, but sometimes I wish he didn't have so much faith in me. And sometimes we wish he didn't. But it's not, it can be expressed in that devotional way, but it's a metaphysical principle, which is the vritti will not be pulled out of the spine unless the river is stronger. The vritti will not be pulled out of the spine unless the river of upward moving energy is strong enough to dislodge it. And therefore, meaning stronger, the upward moving energy is stronger than the power of the vritti to hold itself in place. And it's a metaphysical relationship. It cannot be drawn to the surface unless there's enough upward moving energy to pull it out. And therefore, now we're finally getting back to courage and confidence. If it's sent to you, it's yours. If it's sent to you, by definition, you have the capacity to deal with it. And, you know, the power of spiritual life actually comes down to very, very simple ideas. And this is one of the things that I've learned over a long time from Swamiji and from a lot of experience in my own life. Because it is not easy, we imagine it's very complicated. And there's a huge difference between something being not easy and it being complicated. In fact, Swamiji put it one way once that was so gorgeous. He said it in a satsang one evening, and then the next morning he said, I don't know, when there were just a few of us there, he said, I don't know how many people really heard me last night, he said, so I want to say it again because it's very important. Okay, this world is the vibration of the spirit. All the saints and masters say there's only one reality, and that reality is divine. Even the scientists are telling us that all of this variation is really nothing. It's just vibrations of different types, energy vibrating in different ways. And I know there's all kinds of other theories. The physicists are going way down, and they cannot find any inherent differentiation. Everything keeps coming back to one, which, surprise, surprise, is what the masters have been saying forever. They went inside, and that's where they saw it. But because this world is so complicated, just driving on the streets of Los Angeles, I was actually having a slight aversion to the streets of Los Angeles, and I'll thank Sai Ganesh, who's from Chennai. And he said, Los Angeles, it looks more like India than any other place in America. And all of a sudden I said, if it were Bangalore, I'd love it. So I like Los Angeles a whole lot more, because now I compare it to Delhi or Mumbai. But in any case, it's so diverse. It's just so stunningly different. And all of us in the room with our enormously varied histories and everything we've been through, it's just, how diverse is it? So when we start thinking of the creator of it all, or the power that runs it, the mind naturally imagines that, well, with all this complexity, God must be even more complex. Isn't that so? And thus we have these theologies and these metaphysical speculations. But Swamiji put it like this. Okay, the more things vibrate, the more distant they get. If it is, in fact, all the same substance in various forms, much of it doesn't look much like our concept of divinity, does it? Some of it is actually quite evil. And people are very, very far from the light and doing many stunning things that do not seem to bear a resemblance from the divine. But the light can be shining, but you can get far enough away from it and shroud yourself sufficiently that none of it is reflected from you, right? But that doesn't mean you're still different. You've just vibrated out so far. But what happens when we get closer and closer back toward our source? Even by very definition, we become more still inside of ourselves, don't we? And instead of everything seeming so complicated, it actually becomes simpler and simpler and simpler. And Swamiji was explaining to us, and this is why they say, suffer little children to come unto me, for such is the kingdom of God. Don't misunderstand that. Children are, for the most part, incompetent. They can't function well in this world. But there is a simplicity to their awareness, isn't there? They just see things in a certain way and that's what Master was really speaking of, because everything is very simple for a child. Oh, look, this little rock, I'll play with this rock, and there's Mommy, and when are you going to feed me? And I know that you all live just to take care of me, your own life. Oh, don't be kidding. You belong to me, and you're here to serve me. I said to one of my friends that her little daughter was born kind of this old woman. She looked like kind of a sour old woman for a couple of years. And she always just looked like this annoyed dowager, like, where are the servants? And I finally said, when she was about 3, I said to her parents, she seems to have sort of lost that where are my servants look. And her father began to laugh. He said, yeah, because she found them, her mother and me. But where I was the closer we get back to that center, it all goes into unity, until in fact it goes into absolute singularity. Physicists say this, and sages say this. And so instead of it being complex, it's very simple. To love or not to love. To fear or not to fear. To know that life is being guided by a loving Divine Mother, by a caring Heavenly Father, that you are made of the same. And all you have to do is remember that and live accordingly. It's very, very simple and very hard to do. But don't make it harder by thinking it's also complicated. And our job, which is overwhelmingly challenging, is to repudiate all these vrittis that we don't even know are there. But we experience them in our hearts, and then they agitate our minds. What am I afraid of? I went through a very difficult transition in my life many years ago. And I was already living at Ananda, and I very much wanted to do what God wanted me to do. But no matter how much I prayed, I simply couldn't get an answer. And I went to Swamiji and threw myself rather dramatically in front of him and just literally sobbed. It's so hard to know what God wants. And Swami said, no, it's not. That's just what he said. He said, no, it's not. And then he wouldn't say anything else to me. And he was not given to koans. So it wasn't, but there was nothing else to say. But later I reflected and I said, it's very hard for me to know. And I was meditating on this. And at first I thought he had said that it wasn't hard for him to know God's will. But when I listened more carefully, and Swami was a writer, and he always said exactly what he meant. Our joke was the editor never sleeps. So he always said exactly what he meant. So I knew that if he had meant to say it wasn't hard for him to know, he would have said that. He'd said something very different, that it wasn't hard to know. So I'm meditating and communicating with him inwardly. Well, it's pretty darn hard for me to know. You know, look how hysterical I am in my sincerity, and I'm as ignorant as ever. And the voice came back to me and said, well, you don't want to know. Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I became so dramatic about it. But and then so I changed the question. Why is it so hard for me to know? Well, because you're afraid of the answer. It was so simple and so absolutely irrefutable. I've never forgotten it. And every time we make it complicated, what to do, I change the prayer. What am I afraid of? What am I holding on to? And in that particular situation, as soon as I asked that question, the whole situation just played out in my mind. I knew exactly how it was going to end, and I just didn't want it to end like that. It was no mystery. It wasn't dense at all. It was that I was really unhappy about what was about to happen. Beginning, middle, end of story. Likes and dislikes of the heart. Why is the mind foggy? Because I have to have it this way. My happiness depends on it being this way. But now you have to go this extra step of faith, and there's no other way except to build this, and you have to build it step by step. If we are the children of a loving divine mother, if there is a divine power, and if that divine power is taking us by the hand to some place that we really want to go, how is it possible that this cannot be within God's plan for us? And if we really are being guided by God or Guru or an angel of light or however you want to say it, how much courage can we have based not on any confidence in ourselves, but just on the simple fact that if this is being asked of me, then I must also have the power within me to face this. And you can be very honest in your prayers. I found that pretense gets you nowhere. I remember I spent about 2 years once pretending to a certain attitude, at the end of which Swami said to me, "You never fooled me," just like that. And we were in such a mess. I was in such a mess by that point. Oh, how much less can you fool the infinite spirit, which is your own heart? But you can be very honest. I've had to pray, I don't even want this outcome, but I want this outcome. It's just like, it won't get you anywhere to put on some kind of a front, because it's the vrittis, they don't lie. That's where the word metaphysics comes from. I mean, it becomes religion, but it's just metaphysics. You are what you are, and there's absolutely no hiding from it. And if your only prayer is to want, or even to say, I don't want this at all. These are the prayers that you have to have. I've had to say in front of my altar, I have a dim theoretical commitment to your will. But that's the best I can offer you right now. But if that's the best you can offer, it gets very simple. It's just, I'm going to resist this one as long as I can. And then usually, at least for me, the stages of grief include anger. And it's just, I was very angry at a situation because I knew that in the end I would have to have the right attitude. And I really didn't want to have the right attitude. I wanted other people to apologize and come to me. But nobody was going to. And in the end, I would have to have the right attitude. So I just spent quite a long time being angry about that. Perfectly conscious of the fact that I was just having a tantrum. But when you have a tantrum, you have a tantrum. You know, okay, Divine Mother, excuse me, I'm going to have a tantrum about the fact that sooner or later, I'm going to have to face it. But not now. But then, darn it, later on you do. Because what choice do you have? And that's what you have to get so deep in yourself. If you have found yourself in this room, if you have found yourself anywhere where anyone is talking to you, not about how to manipulate this universe and make it work for you, and get what you want, and learn to negotiate, and get your little, what people don't even wear power suits anymore, but whatever it is that people wear and do, whatever the story is now, there are lots of people who'll tell you that's the answer to life. But it isn't. It'll get you through for a while, but there's a great deal of difference, and this is important, between being pleased by what's going on around you and actually being happy. Actually being happy, meaning a happiness that is not dependent on being pleased. And you can be very happy because everything is pleasing to you, but then sooner or later it won't be. It's the nature of life. You die, if nothing else, or somebody that you love does. So to be really happy is to have anchored yourself in the fact that, well, as I love to put it, if we haven't reached the happy ending, we're not at the end of the story yet. So this is an exciting chapter in which the heroine loses her nerve. But there's more to the book. I mean, I literally often think of it like that. If it isn't the happy ending, it's not the end of the book. And I hope that there's not a lot more to the book, but that's all right. And the photo caption way of running your own life. You know, this is the picture of the heroine when she loses her nerve. And she's, you know, crumpled in front of her altar, asking God for an alternative, and he doesn't seem to be offering it. So she just remains crumpled in front of her altar until she regains her nerve. And that's the only way we can do it. Now, there are thousands of techniques: meditation, prayer, affirmation, energization, yoga postures, music, you know, and they're all taught here, and they're taught in other places too, because God knows we need help. But we need to use that help in the right way. And we use it to become like Swami, to be able to face this world wanting one thing, and that's just simply what's true, and the truth will set you free. So, do we have any questions? Protestations? Laments? Asking me if there's an alternative? Yes.
So I think you answered the question, but when we have those retreats and we want to let them go,
Let them go.
what does it take? Does it take it in the mind or the heart? And, my own experience, I think I've gone a long way to let go of the attachment, identification. But I know that there's still there. Like there's a little bit or a lot left. I don't know how much.
You don't know how much.
I know of progress, but I just don't know. There's a big act of courage, like still remain to be done. Or is it on the path, or is it going to be? What does it take at the end of the day? Is it like a sudden thing, or is it gradual?
When we were in our 20s and on the village, heaven on earth, absolutely beautiful, surrounded by friends, living with Swami Kriyananda, Master said, in India, they have a cultural context and they know that to realize God is very difficult. So people don't really seriously, most people don't seriously think that they can do it. Oh, my karma, you know, someday. Master said he came to America, and Americans had no context whatever. And Americans, the American culture, whether you're born here or not, is we can do it. So he said, realize God. And Americans said, sure, we can do it. And partly that attitude of just Of course we can do it. Why not? We can do anything. I mean, it's the best and worst of America. We can do anything, and as a consequence, we can do a lot. So part of it is just that belief that my guru says I can do this and I can do this. And my guru promises to help me, and he'll help me. After that, it's just literally you put one foot in front of the other. And it's a delicate balance between claiming your victories and not imagining that the little hillock you're standing on is actually the top of the mountain. I read recently, I saw a movie actually, it was quite good. It was called Beyond the Edge, and it was about the first ascent of Everest. It's a very well done movie. They dramatize the scene with very good actors, but the actors never speak. And the soundtrack is actually actual interviews with the people who did it. And Hillary and Tenzing, when they were going up Everest, they just kept talking about it was one false summit after another. They would just drag themselves up to the top of what they thought was the last one because nobody had ever done it before. And then there was another. They'd get to there, and then there was another, and they'd get to there, and then it was another. And when they actually finally got to the peak, they didn't, they weren't certain until they were standing there that they'd actually finally finished. And to a certain extent, the spiritual path is like that because we literally cannot imagine, because we do not have the consciousness yet to know what absolute freedom looks like. So you have to have this balance point of confidence that I'm doing the right thing and I'm making progress and I can see my progress, and humility to realize I don't know how much longer this is going to take, and the courage not to care. Swamiji, in his Lessons for Disciples, the first quality of a disciple is courage. And when Swamiji was asked what makes the difference between success or failure on the path, one of the first answers he gave was to realize that this is a life or death matter, and you have no choice. And see, if you have no choice, then what difference does it make how long it's going to take? You have no choice. And you save yourself a whole lot of trouble by just realizing it doesn't really matter how long or short this is, how difficult or easy this is. I'm just going to keep going. But the thing about the spiritual life, which you have already discovered, is that it's not like it's all blackness and then suddenly you're in the light. It's like today is a lot better than yesterday. And when I face a problem that used to just, blow me out of the water, now I just sort of sail through it. It's just a few splashes here and there. That every step of the way is in itself liberating. And then, now, one of the things that I think really helps you succeed, you asked how do you succeed? One is constantly reflect on all the ways that God has saved you. Master has rules for marriage and has this one thing about how a couple should reminisce about their courtship. Remind each other of, how gloriously the whole thing started. So in case it's not going so well, they will still have that in mind. And so on the spiritual path, every time God helps you, make deep note of that in your soul, so that when you begin to doubt, you have a backlog of remembering. In the end, I have no idea how spiritual progress actually happens. I've been asked this question a lot lately for some reason, and my answer is always the same. Don't quit. That is the only true answer I have right now. I mean, of course, I'm not teaching all the techniques and all the methods. By all means, practice as many of the things that Master taught us that as you possibly can. He said you only have to practice 1/100th? Yeah, I used to say 1/10th, but it's actually 1/100th of the things he taught. But he said everybody takes a different part. That's why I have to teach so much. Of course, use every technique and method and attitude that you can possibly use. But in the end, simply keep going. And that's what you have to fight against. I mean, I've watched this for decades now. And we've been in the same temple for almost 30 years, so I've watched the same population. But people will vaporize. They'll be around for a long time, then they'll vaporize. And maybe years later they'll come back, or a year later. Why did you stop coming? Oh, well, I was having so much difficulty in my job and in my relationship and with my money. That's a reason to stop? That's the absolute reason to turn in toward it and to cling all the harder. But your mind will tell you. When things get hard, you'll use that as a justification. And this is my favorite of Satan's ploys. And please hear me, this is the devil speaking. I like the devil. I like the devil because you can really personify the enemy if you call it the devil. He'll say, oh, you're feeling so negative today. You don't want to bring everybody down. You should not go to the meditation. You should not go to the temple. You should not go to the satsang. You're going to bring everyone down. No, they're going to bring you up. But you want to protect your negativity by not exposing it to the light. So the more horrible you feel, and the way I look at it is, they can cope with you. You know, it's their job to help you. And when you get out of the woods, it'll be your job to help someone else. We're all in this together. Just don't quit. When you feel down, turn toward the light and not away from it. No matter how crummy, even if you just sit back in the corner and grouse, or sit in the front seat and cry, it doesn't matter. You're there. You've shown up. You recognize that this is the answer. All right? Yes?
I was wondering if you could speak to, or if you had any suggestions in regards to family and friends just not at all understanding your path.
They won't understand. When your vibration begins to change, people that were close to you and that you were in tune with, you won't be in tune with it. Doesn't mean that they're bad people, it's just your vibration changes. And it's one of the many, many tests on the spiritual path. Am I doing this because everybody I feel comfortable with is all supporting me? Not likely. You may be lucky. You know, we have sibling groups, we have parents and children, we have many people who draw on their friends. It does happen, but it's no guarantee. And the best thing to do is, first is this, recognize that other people's doubts especially when you're new yourself, can be very disconcerting, so you should not expose yourself to them. You don't imagine that you can just confront them and have them fill your head with negativity. And there's lots of negative things people can say about the path in general, about Ananda specifically, about, they can say tons of things. And when you barely know what you're doing, you don't want to just go out and swim in the cesspool of everybody else's doubts, especially when they're very likely not really thinking about your life. Maybe it's sincere, maybe it's not. They're just fear-based and want you to stay like them. Right. And they may be well-meaning, but people have no imagination. They're to be different. And don't try to explain yourself or justify yourself either, because if you're new, you can't explain it. Well, you see, there are these masters, and this is the Deathless Master. He lives in the Himalayas, and he still has Jesus, and he spoke to him. I mean, you're something nuts. And the people are going to look at you, and they're going to tell you that you're nuts. And then it's going to sound really nutty to you too, because for new people, it's more of a feeling. And when you try to intellectualize it, you just lose it. So one, try not to get in those conversations at all. Or two, have a slight sense of humor about it. And just say, wow, well, I'll keep that in mind. Sri Teshwar had suggested, well, perhaps you're right. I'll keep that in mind. And just, perhaps they are right, and you will keep it in mind. Because if you become defensive and start to argue, people will perceive that you're not certain, and then they'll attack even more. And what little certainty you have will just be washed away. So you really can't afford to get in those conversations.
So just avoid.
Well, either avoid it, or if it comes, just make yourself soft. And you just say, yeah, I'm just starting out. I just started, and so far it looks pretty good. Yeah, Babaji is a little hard to swallow. Wow, I'll keep that in mind. I've heard this, I've heard that. Well, isn't that interesting? I'll just have to keep that in mind. And then there's nothing for people to do, as long as you're humble. It's when you feel you have to put out this facade of certainty when you don't have it. Or you just say, excuse me, my life, be quiet, which is another alternative. Or, gee, oh, I'm so sorry, I just can't meet you today. You know, sometimes you just have to do it. Yogananda said to his disciple, Dr. Lewis had actually been the leader of a completely other organization, and then he met Master, and Master wanted him to come and just leave all of that behind. And Dr. Lewis said, but, you know, these are my friends, this is all of this. Master's answer was very interesting. He said, you can't allow yourself to be ruled by sentiment. Sentiment's a very interesting word, which is sentiment is not necessarily love or duty. It's just habit. I went to college with these people, you know, this is my mother, but it's just, if it's not really serving your progress toward God, you can bless them, but you don't have to, it's sentiment more than wisdom that's holding you. And it's a real tough test. But often it comes very early, because God wants to know how serious you are. You know, how much spine do you have? Because if you don't have enough spine to stand up to that, you don't have enough spine to be on the path. So why waste the time? You have to just say for yourself, I know what I'm doing and I'm going to do it. And they, you know, my parents over the 30-some, 40 years that they lived while I was part of Ananda, they oscillated greatly from liking it and not liking it and liking it and not liking it. As I mentioned to you, I was not very strongly influenced. At a certain point, my father decided to be against it for a while. I just looked at him and I said, don't do it. Don't force me to choose, because I won't choose you. He said, you know, I was raised in a Jewish family. I said, I thought you'd be proud of me for taking an original tact in my life. That's what Jews do, don't they? But, you know, there was no sentiment there. But I loved my father. I didn't want it, but I wasn't able to take it from him. Just don't do it. I said, it's foolish if you do that. Well, this is about this. Don't do it. But I was fixed to that. Any other thoughts or questions?
Walk like a man, even though you walk alone. Why court approval once the road is known? Let come who will, but if they all turn home, the goal still awaits you. Go on alone. Give life your heart, bless everything that's grown. Life's fear not the loving, all this world's your own. Make rich the soil, but once the seed is sown, seek freedom, don't linger. Go on alone. Follow your dream, though it lead to worlds unknown. Life's but a shadow, once our dreams have flown. What if men cry, your dream is not our own? Your soul knows the answer. Go on alone. Sing with me. Walk like a man, even though you walk alone. Why court approval once the road is known? Let come who will, Yeah.